All right, I think what we'll do is we'll just get started here. And so hopefully we are having a good start to this day, and it is an advisory Tuesday. So again, hopefully it's been a good start for you. Anyone have anything for the good of the cause before we start? All right. So, way our agenda looks like today, I want to finish the notes that I started yesterday, the second part of it, looking at the outbreak of the Second World War, and more specifically looking at Japan. And historians like to make the claim that the Second World War in Asia is Japan's war. So we want to take a look at that and then give you some time to work on the road to the Second World War assignment, which is actually due today. So with that, I will want to let's get started here with the second part. So let me share that. And you can find a copy of these in Schoology, so you can follow along with that. Add some more things to it if you want as we go through this. All right, so when we look at this particular phase of the outbreak of the Second World War, or before I even get to that part, if we reflect a little bit on yesterday, if I can just throw a few points out about yesterday with the causes of the Second World War in Europe, and actually I want to fast forward through this here. Don't want to start necessarily from the beginning, is that when we look at Adolf Hitler, he comes to power legally in 1933 as chancellor. And once he gets into power, he enacts very quickly on what we call that master plan. So from about 1933 to 1939, he, as well as the people that are within the German government who are going to contribute to implementing this master plan, we could say that he acts rather quickly. There is a method to it. There is, in some ways, it looks like even a premeditated nature to master plan and the actions that he is doing. And so, again, very quickly, we see that play out in Europe. Now, in Asia, and we look at the emergence of Japan in Asia, and then eventually the war breaking out in that part of the world, we will see that Japan, it's going to take Japan a longer time span to eventually get to that point where we say an outbreak of a war occurs in Asia and becomes part of that Second World War. So see if I can make that case today as we progress through this. So I want to look at Japan's war, and a historian, R. Overy's view about Japan. Japanese ruling circles in the 1930s were united in their view that Japanese power and future prosperity rested on carving out a similar to the Western European powers empires are for themselves in Asia, reproducing in the Far East what they saw as the dominant features of Western international behavior. So again, if we look at a takeaway related to this, we can say, one, it's like Japan is doing what the Europeans are doing. If they were going to be considered a world power in the 19th century, they're going to have to make some changes, and they're going to have to accelerate their transformation, and ultimately, to be at the table that the Western powers are at, they're going to have to engage in expansion, and they will do that. And as they expand, though, it will create tension, and we know that imperialism is going to create tension among the various powers. So with that, I want to look at a number of factors that play into Japan emerging as a world power, and then perhaps contributing to the outbreak of the Second World War. You know, as we always go through this, make sure that if you have any questions, you pop in, ask those questions, or if you want to add a thought to it, go right ahead. So one thing that perhaps we may have remembered from world history that maybe you took in 10th grade, that Japan has a strong military tradition. All right, so we're looking at militarism here. And that military tradition is associated with like the shogun and the samurais. And in the 19th century, Japan is going to emerge in the Meiji era as a fairly modern nation. Now, they had been closed off for many years, and so that transformation is going to be accelerated. Now, some of this military tradition is going to transfer into this new modern Japan, this new empire that's going to be created here. And part of that military tradition is the samurai code, and I believe we're going to call that code Bushido. That code is going to transfer into this new era of Japan. Now, also, when we look at this new era, the National Armed Forces is going to have to be modernized and expanded. And so what we will see happen to the National Armed Forces, it's going to become fairly westernized. The military officers are going to be sent out around the world to kind of observe, see what's going on, bring back that information, and help apply that to the modernization of the Japanese armed forces. That will also include new technology, but then also this idea of compulsory military service. So all this is going to be part of this this modernization of the national armed forces. And then also during this Meiji era, where militarism is evolving, there's this culture of militarism that is going to emerge. And you can see that in the school curriculum. You can see that military officers or the old samurais are going to find themselves in political institutions as bureaucrats. But militarism, this culture of militarism, is beginning to emerge, which also is going to be a natural complement to this idea of nationalism and ideology. And so nationalists associated expansion with the greater glory of the emperor god. So anything that is going to be done is going to be the name of the emperor. It kind of gives that rubber stamp approval to whatever they will do. And that in some ways is a result of the Meiji era, in which the emperor is still have tremendous reverence in the Japanese society. And so it is important to keep that image and keep that reverence continuing. And so nationalists understand that, and they can take that onto their expansionist agenda. The expansion territory after 1874 represents the emergence of a new industrial military power. And so near the end of the 19th century, Japan is a modern military state, but it needs to test it. And in order to test it, that could mean acquiring territory. That also could mean taking on other countries. And so examples of this would be like in 1895 when Japan acquires Formosa, which we'll simply call Taiwan. They do engage in an armed conflict with Russia, 1904 to 1905, and they're fairly successful against Russia. They're very upset, though, with the treaty, considering how successful they were in that conflict. And then simply outright annexed the Korean peninsula, or the Korean kingdom in 1910. So all that kind of represents this new industrial military power. There were patriotic associations which set up traditional culture as superior to Western culture. And so this is this ideology that's being evolved and formulated at this time. And in the 1920s, you really see the emergence of these patriotic associations. They're very ultra-nationalistic. They're anti-Western, which will resonate with the military. And again, the strong element of racial superiority. This idea is reinforced in the schools, whether it's in the curriculum, also in messages, and then the propaganda as well. So we have a number of factors that is contributing to this new way of thinking, but now looking at some factors that can kind of put it into motion. And this would be like some economic pressure. Now, one thing that we will talk about for nations is this sense of autarky, which is self-sufficiency. And Japan is going to lack autarky. Japan's shortage of essential raw materials for modern technology and military were motives for expansion. The economy of Japan is not quite there on the scale of the United States and the European powers, and so it needs to find essential raw materials if they're going to be a modern, technologically advanced nation, military advanced nation here. And so what you see is a strong economic motive is going to be the reason for the conquest of Manchuria in 1931. And there doesn't seem to be any mechanism for responsible government and lack of civilian control in the military or over the military. And that really starts to show in the 1930s. And so the military, in some ways, looks at itself as the vehicle to solve Japan's problems. And in this case, the shortage of essential raw materials that can be found in Manchuria. Now, in the West, they do have the ability that they could probably step in. You got the League of Nations. We sometimes think the League of Nations doesn't have armed capability. It's true that they do not have like what the UN has with is a peacekeeping force, but they still could, if they can get enough of the League Nations membership to agree to it, they could possibly put some military pressures or at least economic sanctions against Japan here. But there just seems to be a reluctancy on the West to really get involved here. And so Japan is getting bold in what they're doing. And then what we see in the 1930s and then emerges by 1940, this idea of a coal prosperity zone. It's an idea that was floated by Prince Kono. And the idea is make this region, the Asia-Pacific region, a region for Japan, but kind of showcase it as we're going to get rid of Western powers and the prosperity is going to be shared by all. But really the motive here is the prosperity is going to be shared by Japan. So when we look at some political factors that play a role here and the outbreak of the war, Japan does emerge as a world power. And we could see that at the end of the First World War. And they feel that, you know, they want their place at the table, but they're not being viewed as the same as the other powers. And maybe because they're viewed as an Asian power, and there's potentially race being a part of the attitude of Western nations here. The government was heavily influenced by the military, and so there's a lack of checks in the government on the military here, and military officers are going to find themselves in bureaucratic positions, find themselves in those positions to influence governmental policy here. And Japan had plans for political development of an independent Asia, free from colonialism, with their protection. And in the previous slide, I had mentioned the co-prosperity zone, and that's really what they're looking at. So creating their spheres of influence that is built on anti-Western views. And so that's that ideology coming into play here as well. And what we're going to find out is the territory that they do begin to take over simply become conquered territories that will be exploited and oppressed. Puppet regimes will be established wherever the Japanese armed forces are going to go. And so it is becoming apparent that this idea of co-prosperity sphere is really only one for Japan. Now, all of this, though, all this action that they are doing is naturally going to be creating tension with European powers, but also with the United States. And so when we look at Japan's path to war, and I had mentioned that it's a little bit longer and more elaborate than we compare that to Adolf Hitler, Germany, and in Europe. This path to war really starts in, if we want to look just in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century with the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, and goes all the way up to the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now, we could make a claim that the Sino-Japanese War, 1937, is really kind of like the beginning of this second phase, or this part of the Second World War. But we're going to go all the way up to 1941. And throughout that, you can see that there is contention with the West, whether it's through agreements and negotiations, but then also possibly through armed conflict as well. So your task really today, as I'm getting this piece going here, is do we have any follow-up to my notes first? Any follow-ups or anything that needs to get clarified? All right, so your task really for today is looking at what is going on in Asia and how Japan is moving towards the outbreak of the Second World War. Because we want to make a claim to what extent was Japan responsible for the outbreak of war in the Pacific here. All right, and we're going to find that, and I do see in the chat there this idea that the United States is part of creating some tension here, and imperialism is a part of this as well. Yes, all that stuff is interwoven in here. It's incredible how it is. Just like looking at the events in Europe, we want to see, you know, here is the event, you know, why is Japan doing it? Here's what the West is responding, and do we think this is a major or a minor thing here? And so here we've got example, the Russo-Japanese War. Japan was emboldened by early victories over China. Russia was not impressed. They were interested in ice-free harbor of Port Arthur and Manchuria, as well as Russians. The alliance with Great Britain gave Japan a stronger position. In many cases, some of these smaller wars are part of this whole balance of power in Europe, and trying to maybe equalize or take down one of the one of the European powers here, and this can be a good example of it. Great Britain had remained neutral because the alliance sided with Japan. The United States acted as a mediator, resulted in Treaty of Portsmouth, which I believe is in New Hampshire, and Japan had inspired the respect of the West. In some ways, we look at this as a major cause. If Europeans hadn't woke up, they need to wake up to what is going on with Japan. One could say, got to take notice, show respect, all that. For Russia, it definitely was a wake-up moment for them. They need to quickly industrialize as well. For the United States, we are trying to exercise our newfound world power status under Theodore Roosevelt, but it's creating tension with Japan as well. So now you need to look at some of these other events here, and you can find that in Chapter 7 of your textbook, and as a resource to help you answer these questions. Okay? So with that, anyone have any questions or concerns about this activity, Road to the Second World War, that I need to clarify at this point? Okay. You can put that in the chat. If you do have further questions, you can just stay on and I can clarify it at that moment. Or you can stop in at office hours as well, or shoot me an email whenever you need to. With that, you are free to exit, and I hope you have a fantastic